lateral border of the rectus, extends from the cartilage of the ninth rib to the pubic tubercle, and is formed by the aponeurosis of the obliquus internus at its line of division to enclose the rectus, reinforced in front by that of the obliquus externus, and behind by that of the transversus. Actions. When the pelvis and thorax are fixed, the abdominal muscles compress the abdominal viscera by constricting the cavity of the abdomen, in which action they are materially assisted by the descent of the diaphragm. By these means assistance is given in expelling the feces from the rectum, the urine from the bladder, the fetus from the uterus, and the contents of the stomach in vomiting. If the pelvis and the vertebral column be fixed, these muscles compress the lower part of the thorax, materially assisting expiration. If the pelvis alone be fixed, the thorax is bent directly forward when the muscles of both sides act. When the muscles of only one side contract, the trunk is bent toward that side and rotated toward the opposite side. If the thorax be fixed, the muscles, acting together, draw the pelvis upward, as in climbing, or, acting singly, they draw the pelvis upward and bend the vertebral column to one side or the other. The recti, acting from below, depress the thorax and consequently flex the vertebral column. When acting from above, they flex the pelvis upon the vertebral column. The pyramidalis are tensors of the linea alba. The transversalis fascia. The transversalis fascia is a thin aponeurotic membrane which lies between the inner surface of the transversus and the extraperitoneal fat. It forms part of the general layer of fascia lining the abdominal parodes and is directly continuous with the iliac and pelvic fasciae. In the inguinal region, the transversalis fascia is thick and dense in structure and is joined by fibers from the aponeurosis of the transversus, but it becomes thin as it ascends to the diaphragm and blends with the fascia covering the undersurface of this muscle. Behind, it is lost in the fat which covers the posterior surfaces of the kidney. Below, it has the following attachments. Posteriorly, to the whole length of the iliac crest, between the attachments of the transversus and iliacus. Between the anterior superior iliac spine and the femoral vessels, it is connected to the posterior margin of the inguinal ligament, and is there continuous with the iliac fascia. Medial to the femoral vessels, it is thin and attached to the pubis and pectineal line, behind the inguinal aponeurotic falx, with which it is united. It descends in front of the femoral vessels to form the anterior wall of the femoral sheath. Beneath the inguinal ligament it is strengthened by a band of fibrous tissue, which is only loosely connected to the ligament, and is specialized as a deep crural arch. The spermatic cord in the male and the round ligament of the uterus in the female pass through the transversalis fascia at a spot called the abdominal inguinal ring. This opening is not visible externally, since the transversalis fascia is prolonged on these structures as the infundibuliform fascia. The abdominal inguinal ring. Annulus inguinalis abdominis, internal or deep abdominal ring. The abdominal inguinal ring is situated in the transversalis fascia, midway between the anterior superior iliac spine and the symphysis pubis, and about 1.25 centimeters above the inguinal ligament. It is of an oval form, the long axis of the oval being vertical. It varies in size in different subjects, and is much larger in the male than in the female. It is bounded, above and laterally, by the arched lower margins of the transversus, below and medially by the inferior epigastric vessels. It transmits the spermatic cord in the male and the round ligament of the uterus in the female. From its circumference, a thin funnel-shaped membrane, the infundibuliform fascia, is continued around the cord and the testis, enclosing them in a distinct covering. The inguinal canal. Canalus inguinalis, spermatic canal. The inguinal canal contains the spermatic cord and the ilioinguinal nerve in the male, and the round ligament of the uterus and the ilioinguinal nerve in the female. It is an oblique canal about 4 centimeters long, slanting downward and medialward, and placed parallel with and a little above the inguinal ligament. It extends from the abdominal inguinal ring to the subcutaneous inguinal ring. It is bounded in front by the integument and superficial fascia, by the aponeurosis of the obliquus externus throughout its whole length, and by the obliquus internus in its lateral third. Behind, by the reflected inguinal ligament, the inguinal aponeurotic falx, the transversalis fascia, the extraperitoneal connective tissue, and the peritoneum. Above, by the arched fibers of the obliquus internus and the transversus abdominis. Below, by the union of the transversalis fascia with the inguinal ligament, and at its medial end by the lacunar ligament. Extraperitoneal connective tissue. Between the inner surface of the general layer of the fascia, which lines the interior of the abdominal and pelvic cavities, and the peritoneum, there is a considerable amount of connective tissue termed the extraperitoneal or subperitoneal connective tissue. The parietal portion lines the cavity in varying quantities in different situations. It is especially abundant on the posterior wall of the abdomen, and particularly around the kidneys, where it contains much fat. On the anterior wall of the abdomen, except in the pubic region, and on the lateral wall above the iliac crest, it is scanty, and here the transversalis fascia is more closely connected with the peritoneum. There is a considerable amount of extraperitoneal connective tissue in the pelvis. The visceral portion follows the course of the branches of the abdominal aorta between the layers of the mesenterics and other folds of the peritoneum which connect the various viscera to the abdominal wall. The two portions are directly continuous with each other. The deep crural arch. Curving over the external iliac vessels at the spot where they become femoral, on the abdominal side of the inguinal ligaments and loosely connected with it, is a thickened band of fibers called the deep crural arch. It is apparently a thickening of the transversalis fascia joined laterally to the center of the lower margin of the inguinal ligament, and arching across the front of the femoral sheath to be inserted by a broad attachment into the pubic tubercle and pectineal line, behind the inguinal aponeurotic falx. In some subjects this structure is not very prominently marked, and not infrequently it is altogether wanting. 2. The posterior muscles of the abdomen. Psoas major, psoas minor, iliacus, quadratus lumborum. The psoas major, the psoas minor, and the iliacus, with the fasciae covering them, will be described with the muscles of the lower extremity. See page 466. The fasciae covering the quadratus lumborum. This is a thin layer attached medially to the bases of the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae, below to the iliolumbar ligament, above to the apex and lower border of the last rib. The upper margin of this fascia, which extends from the transverse process of the first lumbar vertebra to the apex and lower border of the last rib, constitutes the lateral lumbocostal arch, page 405. Laterally, it blends with the lumbodorsal fascia, the anterior layer of which intervenes between the quadratus lumborum and the sacrospinalis. The quadratus lumborum, page 398, is irregularly quadrilateral in shape and broader above than below. It arises by aponeurotic fibers from the iliolumbar ligament and the adjacent portion of the iliac crest for about 5 centimeters, and is inserted into the lower border of the last rib for about half its length, and by 4 small tendons into the apices of the transverse processes of the upper 4 lumbar vertebrae. Occasionally, a second portion of this muscle is found in front of the preceding. It arises from the upper borders of the transverse processes of the lower 3 or 4 lumbar vertebrae, and is inserted into the lower margin of the last rib. In front of the quadratus lumborum are the colon, the kidney, the psoas major and minor, and the diaphragm. Between the fascia and the muscle are the 12th thoracic, iliolinguinal, and iliohypogastric nerves. Variations. The number of attachments to the vertebrae and the extent of its attachment to the last rib vary. Nerve supply. The 12th thoracic and 1st and 2nd lumbar nerves supply this muscle. Actions. The quadratus lumborum